Welcome to the WTO's annual Agriculture Symposium, which this year is dedicated to the topic of illicit trade in food and food fraud. We've chosen this topic for two reasons. One, because WTO Director-General Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala has long been committed to the fight against illicit trade, which is a phenomenon that undermines legitimate business activity, fuels corruption, and acts as a drain on government resources. In the case of food fraud, more specifically, it can also endanger human, animal, plant life, or health, as you can imagine. Dr. Ngozi has asked that the WTO Secretariat examine how WTO rules can help countries confront the challenge of illicit trade. Two, because WTO outreach events are an excellent opportunity to connect the WTO rulebook and its agriculture negotiations to broader food policy discussions. This symposium is a two-day event. It will bring together WTO ambassadors, members of the WTO Secretariat, and various experts from international organizations, businesses, civil society, and academia for a deep dive into this topic. The goal is to assess how the WTO rulebook can help the world respond to this challenge. Let me now turn to the first round of questions. Jeff, I'd like to start with you for some scene setting, if I may. Can you walk us through the terminology and typology of food crime and how serious the problem is on the international stage? In particular, how does food crime undermine the Sustainable Development Goals? And please take the time to explain what your organization does so that viewers who are not familiar with it can get acquainted. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Doa. Thank you, Jean-Marie, for inviting me and TRACIT to participate in this panel. I think there are 3 or 4 questions in that one question, Doa. So let me break that down just a little bit. I'll say a word about TRACIT, then the problem, and then I've got a few words I can offer to embellish what you said about what food fraud and food crime is, and then take the last bit of the time to summarize some of the impacts on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But TRACIT as an organization uniquely addresses illicit trade across multiple sectors. So today I'm here working with you on the topic of illicit trade in food or food fraud, but tomorrow we very well may be addressing counterfeiting or falsified and substandard medicines, smuggling of alcohol or pesticides, or any wide range of things, including human trafficking and wildlife crime. So we've got our hands full, and what we try to do are look at what are some of the commonalities that enable illicit trade and try to share best practices across those sectors. So it's always a good opportunity for us to work with intergovernmental organizations like the WTO. Our objectives here are to help raise awareness, to promote higher standards for mitigating illicit trade, and to share best practices, with your member states. And I just want to take 1 second to say how pleased that we are with what WTO has done in this space. I mean, around a year ago, the Director General had a similar initiative on pharmaceuticals, especially drawing attention to falsified and substandard medicines. That's excellent work. The WTO's work on eliminating fishing subsidies certainly goes a long way to mitigating illicit trade in fish and IUU fishing. And then, of course, there's TRIPS, which is really the global standard in protecting intellectual property, which is the #1 thing for stopping counterfeiting, which is a global problem. So I'm thrilled and pleased to see WTO taking a leadership position here in agriculture and illicit trade in food. So having said that, I mean, the seriousness of the problem globally really derives from how important the agricultural section is to the global economy, to employment, to feeding the poor. It's just anything that upsets that delicate balance, that economic engine is extremely serious. And I think that's the #1 reason that we have a focus on illicit trade in food. As you mentioned in the introduction, there are other sectors that also play a role here. We're going to get into the importance of seeds, for example, and pesticides. All of these contribute to a greater global food supply and in turn, greater food security. And illicit, illegal, unauthorized versions of these products, significantly dislocate the economic principles that underlie those three industries. So there's a lot of numbers out there. If you look at the losses to the agricultural sector that are associated with illicit trade, we've calculated that somewhere between 30 to 50 billion. If you throw in losses associated with illicit trade in alcohol, which is important to include because of their dependence on the grains that are produced worldwide, you can add another 50 billion in losses. So it's a significant problem economically. And then just sort of dovetailing to the last part of the question, and so I don't take up too much of the time, is how do we look at how deeply those losses impact the economy and society? And one approach that we took at TRACIT was to look at how illicit trade undermined the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Because those goals have been around for quite a long time, and they're so valuable because they do really dig deep into, what are the main elements of a good society, a good economy. So we have published a report that's available on TRACIT's website. It's going to be one of the chapters in the report that you mentioned. So I'm not going to go, too deeply into all of that right now, but I can quickly tell you that illicit trade in food impacts 11 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So just very quickly, if you look at, if you take SDG 1 and 2 together, which is no poverty and zero hunger, access to healthy food is fundamental to addressing global poverty. So if we can make sure that our food supplies are stronger, we're going to have a better opportunity to preserve the goals of zero hunger. So if you take a look at SDG 3, which is good health and well-being, illicit trade in food exposes consumers to harmful ingredients or deprives them of active beneficial ingredients. Just moving on to SDG 8, which is critical to economic growth worldwide. Illicit trade in food and food fraud siphons GDP, jobs, tax collections from national economies, and introduces risks to the companies and the brands that deliver these foods. I think SDG 12 is an interesting one to look at because that's responsible consumption and production. If you have food fraud that, for example, does not have the ingredient or misrepresents the ingredient, like a kosher or gluten-free product, this deprives the consumers of their choice and their ability to make educated decisions. And the last one that I'll mention really is SDG 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions, because what we've learned about food fraud and illicit trade in food is that is driven mostly by criminal organizations. And the one thing that we found in looking at the SDGs across 12 different sectors is that criminal activity is deeply involved in all of these sectors. And I think we'll probably hear a little bit more from that from the speaker from Unicre. But Doa, that's a quick summary of that first question.
From TRACIT's standpoint, have globalization and international trade in food and longer supply chains essentially increased the complexity of food fraud?
Yeah, thanks, Doa. The answer is yes. That's a pretty easy one. In fact, TRACIT just published a couple of weeks ago a new study where we were looking at how the global supply chain actually facilitates illicit trade. It's the vulnerabilities, I should say. We looked at 4 or 5 different hotspots, online platforms, maritime and air transport, the the global postal system, and the express delivery and free trade zones. These are all hot spots. These are all critical parts of the legal global supply chain that are vulnerable to exploitation by illicit traders across all 10 of the sectors that we work in. So we published that report, and a lot of that's relevant to what we're talking about today. Let me just give you, I've got 5 little quick points here that I can share that give you an idea of what we're talking about here. The first is, over the last 20 years, the global trade has really become global trade, right? So the first problem, the first vulnerability is that the longer supply chains, create more points of vulnerability, more opportunities for different ingredients to be added, different components to be added, different players to be added, which just creates additional opportunities for criminals. Like Antonio says, it could be criminal groups, but it could be opportunistic criminals, which are smaller actors, to take advantage of the far-flung supply chain. I think the second point really is the sheer volume of trade in the food sector. As the global food market truly becomes global, different products are originating in different parts of the world and ending up, on the other side of Earth. So this makes it much more difficult to trace the origin and the authenticity of the products. I think thirdly is, since there are so many, ports and free zones and all types of different, trade routes that overall increase the efficiency and lower the cost of final products to consumers, it's also a chance for, the criminal groups to conceal origin or falsify certificates of origin or misdeclare shipping documents. All of those things are very custom oriented. There's so many things that are going on, and the criminals have a good idea of how to play that system against the legal traders. I think another thing I wanted to highlight is that, there's different regulatory standards, different rules, different enforcement capabilities in different countries. That adds to the complexity and that creates more vulnerabilities. And I think last thing is economic pressures. Higher prices in one market, can create, demand for diversion or for smuggling. For example, if taxes are too high or if market pressures are too high, it creates incentives. I think certainly one of the cases that we deal a lot with is the illicit trade in alcoholic beverages. Those are heavily taxed industries, and sometimes those taxes, whether they're domestic excise taxes or whether they are import levies, that can significantly raise the price of the consumer of the final product, and that creates, price arbitrage opportunity for criminals to smuggle the product in, and give consumers, much lower priced alternatives. Unfortunately, those alternatives are illegal. In some cases, they are lethal in terms of consumer health. But Doa, that's just a quick summary of how, illicit food trade is affected by the global supply chain.
Because there's more than one question for each of you, so I will immediately put 2 questions, let's say, to each of you, and I would ask you to be very brief in responding so the others have a chance to do so as well. Jeff, I'll start with you. There's a question from India that says the following: given that TRACIT works on illicit trade across a range of different sectors, how does the food industry compare to other sectors? That's question number 1. And question number 2 is from Geneva, and it says, how can we boost cooperation across borders?
Okay. Thanks again. How does it compare? Well, I think we're still collecting information across, like I said, 10, 11 different sectors about the magnitudes. And every time we're talking about tens of billions and sometimes hundreds of billions. So let me say something else. I think the situation with illicit trade in food is going to worsen rather than get better. It's going to get worse before it gets better. I think that, there's some sorts of illicit trade that have been around for a long time. I think criminals are finding better ways to exploit this gigantic sector that touches all parts of the world. So I think that's what I want to say, that I think it's going to get worse. And what was the other question?
The other question is on how we can boost cross-border cooperation, in your view.
Well, there, I think you have an important role to play. And there was something I was eager to respond to that Jean-Marie had mentioned, right, on how legal trade is intended to, give developing countries, for example, an opportunity to benefit from globalization. Whereas the flip side of that coin, the black side of that coin, is that illicit trade undermines those goals. I think that in Geneva, this question came from Geneva, I think that there's a great opportunity for the WTO and for the UN Conference on Trade and Development to work more closely together on this. We certainly spent some time working with UNCTAD. I think they're an excellent policy-making body that can address issues on the policy side, and working together with you. You can do a combination of better policies and rules to implement those policies. Because in the end, it's the national governments who need stronger laws in place. And those laws are not just, addressed to customs and stronger border control, which is the root of the question, but also I think it's those national governments need to have tighter controls on the intermediaries that we talked about earlier. Antonia mentioned that, we need to raise awareness of the consumer, the end consumer. Well, I think that's definitely critical. But we have to go back up the supply chain, and the next place up that supply chain are the retailers. As I think in food fraud, the retailers need to have better defenses in place, food defense. They need to better understand who they're buying from and where those vulnerabilities come from. So not just then know your customer for that seller, but then where are those vulnerabilities that we talked about on the supply chain, for bad ingredients, falsified ingredients to come into play, or even, bad seeds. Okay, so I think there's a lot that can be done. I think that Geneva has a good role that can be played at this point.